So, are you being paid exactly what you're worth? You know, most of us really like to think our paycheck is a direct reflection of our true value out there in the job market. We just assume that if we work hard and produce great results, our compensation will perfectly match that output. But the reality is a little bit more complicated, and frankly, a whole lot more fascinating. Well, hold on to your hats because recent macroeconomic research reveals a pretty staggering statistic. The median worker actually takes home only about 70 to 80% of their actual marginal product. What does that mean? It means if your hard work generates, say, $100 of value for your employer, you're likely only seeing 70 to $80 of that hit your bank account. That missing chunk right there, economists call it a wage markdown. It is literally one of the biggest mysteries in the modern job market, and today we're going to figure out exactly where that money goes. Welcome to this explainer on the hidden forces shaping your paycheck. Today, we're diving deep to uncover the invisible macroeconomic forces that are quietly suppressing wages and really dictating career mobility for millions of workers. We're going to look at the hard data, the dominant employers pulling the strings, and the exact mechanisms keeping that wage markdown locked in place. Okay, here's our agenda. 1. The textbook labor market myth. 2. Measuring labor market power. 3. Three mechanisms of power. 4. Why standard methods fail. 5. The minimum wage illusion. And 6. Targeting dominant employers. Let's just dive right in. Section 1. The textbook labor market myth. Why standard economics misses the mark. If you ever sat through an Econ 101 class, you were probably taught this beautiful, flawless model of perfect competition. In that textbook world, you've got tiny, atomistic firms competing flawlessly for workers. And because competition is perfect, workers get paid their exact marginal product. But reality is a whole different ballgame. In the real world, employers actually hold a ton of uneven wage-setting power, and workers often face incredibly limited options. We definitely do not operate in some frictionless spot market. So where does this power actually come from? Well, even if we aren't talking about giant monopolies, everyday frictions basically hand employers the upper hand. First off, there's job differentiation. Look, jobs just aren't identical, right? They've got different amenities, different tasks, different schedules. And because we all value these things differently, firms don't just pay one single going rate. They actually have the power to set wages. Second, search frictions. Think about it, moving your family, changing your kids' schools, or honestly just spending hours filling out job applications. It's costly. Employers know you can't just snap your fingers and teleport to a better job. And third, incomplete information. We simply don't always know what our outside options are. In fact, a recent survey of German workers found that people who could have actually gotten a massive 10% raise just by switching jobs wrongly expected only a 1% bump. All of this just drops bargaining power right into the lap of the employer. All right, Section 2, Measuring Labor Market Power. How concentrated is your local job market? So economists actually put a hard number on this invisible market power using something called the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, or HHI for short. Now, don't let the clunky name intimidate you. It's basically just a tool to measure the invisible grip that employers have on a market. They define your local labor market in a very practical way, usually looking at your commuting zone and your specific industry. The HHI measures exactly how concentrated wage payments are among the companies competing for your specific skills in that specific zone. It calculates this by taking the payroll market share of each company, squaring it, and adding them all up. Now, what's truly staggering here is the sheer scale of this issue. A massive 40% of total U.S. wage payments happen in highly concentrated markets with an HHI over 2,500. To put that into perspective for you, an HHI of 2,500 is literally the official danger zone for the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice. It's the exact threshold where antitrust authorities start getting very, very concerned about market dominance. And nearly half of our wages are paid out right inside that danger zone. And what actually happens to the workers stuck in these highly concentrated zones? Well, studies across multiple countries show some pretty severe wage markdowns. For instance, incredibly detailed data from Denmark shows workers making roughly 79% of the actual value they produce. In the U.S. manufacturing sector, similar studies show workers getting about 65 to 73%. So the median worker is leaving massive amounts of money on the table entirely because of how their local job market is structured. Which brings us to Section 3, Three Mechanisms of Power, How Dominant Firms Control the Market. Okay, we know they have the power, but how exactly are they using it? The research highlights three specific macro mechanisms that allow these dominant large firms to exert outsized control over local wages. Those are granularity, strategic interaction, and misallocation. Let's break these down one by one.
First up is granularity. This happens when a firm is so massive that its individual hiring and wage decisions physically move the market-wide averages. It's kind of wild to think about. Imagine a massive whale swimming in a really small pond. If a single warehousing giant employs 11% of all the warehouse workers in your town, a wage change at that one company mechanically shifts the entire average wage of the local market. They aren't just participating in the market, right? They're so large they basically are the market.
Next is strategic interaction. These granular giants, they don't operate in a vacuum. They interact strategically. Because their footprint is just so huge, they intentionally suppress their own hiring. See, they know that if they hire too aggressively, they'll drive up wages for everyone, including themselves. You actually see this happen when a major employer raises wages, like, say, a huge Veterans Affairs hospital, and suddenly all the nearby clinics are forced to bump up their pay in response. So these firms constantly anticipate their rivals, sometimes even resorting to really shady, legally questionable tactics like no-poach agreements, strictly to ensure they aren't driving up each other's labor costs.
And the third mechanism is misallocation, which honestly is probably the most tragic economic consequence of this whole thing. Because these highly productive giants restrict their hiring just to keep pay low, a lot of talented workers simply get locked out. So where do those workers go? They get stranded at smaller, less efficient companies making lower wages. The talent isn't flowing to where it could be the most productive. In fact, researchers found that this misallocation of talent accounts for about 60% of the overall economic output lost to employer market power. It's a massive drain.
All right, Section 4. Why standard methods fail. The problem with atomistic assumptions. For the longest time, economists really struggled to measure this power correctly. The traditional micro approach assumes firms are small and atomistic. It relies on comparing a treated group to a control group, assuming they don't affect each other at all. But here's the glaring flaw in that logic. If a giant like Walmart raises wages in New Jersey, they might just shift worker hours over to a store in Pennsylvania. The control group is totally contaminated. That's why the new macro approach is a total game changer. It properly accounts for these granular firms and tracks how one giant firm's actions send massive spillovers rippling across the entire market. This deeper understanding leads us right into Section 5, the minimum wage illusion. Is a broad minimum wage the ultimate fix? So let's look at this incredibly popular, politically sensitive policy, but purely through the lens of these macroeconomic models. Traditionally, a lot of folks view a broad minimum wage as the ultimate weapon against employer monopsony power. The standard policy goal is to legally force these powerful employers to raise their baseline pay up to competitive levels, which then raises the absolute wage floor for low-income workers. But the macro models reveal a really fascinating illusion here. While a broad minimum wage absolutely impacts smaller, low-productivity firms, it almost completely misses the massive, dominant employers who are responsible for the largest market distortions. Why is that? Because those dominant, highly productive granular firms usually already pay above the minimum wage. If the core problem is giant firms suppressing the wages of skilled workers who should be making, say, $80,000 but are only making $60,000, a $15 minimum wage doesn't even directly touch them. It just doesn't rein in the dominant players.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 6, Targeting Dominant Employers, Policy Solutions for a Concentrated Market.
The data strongly suggests that we need much more targeted solutions for these highly concentrated markets. Instead of just relying on broad-based rules, the most effective policies go right at the source of the power. We're talking about direct antitrust enforcement in labor markets, like explicitly blocking anti-competitive hospital or corporate mergers that would just hand one single employer way too much local power. Another highly effective tool? Banning restrictive non-compete clauses. Right now, literally tens of millions of workers are bound by non-competes. If you ban them, workers can easily jump ship for a competitor, which then forces the dominant firm to immediately raise pay if they want to keep their best talent. And you have to see this incredible finding from the research. It states that eliminating labor market power would raise wages by 2.6% on average and up to 30% in the most concentrated markets. Just think about that for a second. Depending on your industry, loosening the iron grip of these dominant employers and wiping out that wage markdown could literally result in a 30% boost to your paycheck. And surprisingly, the data shows that high earners actually stand to gain the most here, simply because they are disproportionately employed at the largest firms where the markdowns are the widest. Which brings us to our final thought. The textbook model of perfectly competitive labor markets, yeah, it's pretty much a myth. We live in a world of granular giants, strategic interactions, and highly concentrated power. So as you look at your own career, your local job options, and your next salary negotiation, you really have to ask yourself, who truly dictates the balance of power and the size of the paychecks in your industry? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep analyzing the world around you, keep asking the hard questions, and I'll see you next time.